Skull and Bones, the order at Yale, 15 of them selected out of every junior class. They paid. Wall Street financed Hitler, financed Stalin, creating communism, which is what they did. That's all very bad, and Skull and Bones is all involved in that with the order.
They concerned the build-up of the three types of socialism: Bolshevik socialism in Russia, what we might call welfare socialism in the United States, and Hitlerian or National Socialism. And each book examines the financing and the contributions made by Wall Street, by international bankers, to the development of that specific form of socialism.
It also was involved in changing the American education system from a classical academic, brain-oriented thinking, destroying that, and imposing an animal training method, which Skull and Bones was deeply involved, and I think I would just say the only entity at that time deeply involved, and managed to bring that wretched system of operant conditioning, Pavlov, Skinner, whatever you want to call it, animal training, out of the laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, Wilhelm Wundt, and get it adopted by leading American educators.
Motivation and reward are crucial factors in learning. A motivated animal will learn any response which occurs and is promptly followed by a reduction in the strength of the drive.
My father and grandfather were members of the order. Skull and Bones was put together by William Russell in 1830, secret society at Yale University. And the connections with Germany are pretty extensive. You know, the Illuminati, I think, it's got to be, I think that there's a lot of research out there that I haven't even read that is there, that does connect it with the Illuminati. And the Illuminati, of course, was Bavarian Marxist society based on destroying the family, destroying the church, which at that time was Catholicism, destroying religion, destroying national entities, boundaries, no more. I have, the proofs of a conspiracy by Robeson, an original copy of that, and it says right in there, where the order, it's interesting, the order, right? The goal was to, just as I said, down with the family, down with the royalty. At that time, governments were royalty, and they were religious. That was Western European, right? Down with nationalism, get rid of countries, drop borders. I mean, and people think that that's new. The Illuminati order, this is Skull and Bones, see? The Illuminati order documents show that Raphael in the Illuminati is identified as the same Professor Karl Casimir Wundt. This is fascinating. Kirchenrat Karl Casimir Wundt, the one we're talking about, was professor at Heidelberg University in the history and geography of Baden, this town, and pastor of the church at Oeblingen, a small neighborhood town. So Wundt was connected with the Illuminati, his grandfather. Well, this is the background of Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt, who really trained the American educators in the behavioral psychology, stimulus response training type of Skinner, operant conditioning, bells, whistles, all that stuff, which does not teach, it trains for the workforce. Now, this was the order at Yale was directly connected with Wilhelm Wundt. They sent educators over there to study under Wundt. Stanley Hall was the first one to go. This is so important, this stuff here. The Hegelian influence on Hall. Between 1870 and 1882, a span of 12 months, Hall, the American, there's a lot of information on him here too, but I won't go into it. He was connected with Skull and Bones prior to going over. They probably sent him over. Spent 6 years in Germany And he says, I do not know of any other, this is Hall talking, any other American student of these subjects, philosophy and psychology, who came into even the slight personal contact it was my fortune to enjoy with Hartman and Fechner. They were psychologists over there as well. Nor of any psychologist who had the experience of attempting experimental work with Helmholtz. And I think I was the first American pupil of Wundt. Now, Wundt is the one we're dealing with, Wilhelm Wundt from Germany. He had the first laboratory, and people think that American psychology and all was, the psychologist studied under Pavlov, that Pavlov was the first. No. Pavlov, interestingly enough, studied under Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig. The 12 years included in this span as an American pupil of Wundt, more than any other equal period, marked and gave direction to modern psychology. Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920, professor of philosophy at University of Leipzig, was undoubtedly the major influence on G. Stanley Hall, who was subsequently, who trained, you know, all the others, Thorndike, Dewey, and all of them, okay? And he was sent over, Hall, it appears that he had a lot of connections with the order at Yale, and that's why he ultimately ended up going to Leipzig. Modern education practice stems from Hegelian social theory combined with the experimental psychology of Wilhelm Wundt. The Hegelian theory, you know, create the problem, people scream, impose a solution type of thing. And no right, no wrong, too. Whereas Karl Marx and von Bismarck applied Hegelian theory to the political field, it was Wilhelm Wundt, influenced by Johann Herbart, who applied Hegel, the Hegelian dialectic, to education, which in turn was picked up by Hall and John Dewey and modern educational theorists in the United States. That's to create the problem and people scream and pose a solution. That's the Hegel. Wundt is the animal training method that bypasses the brain. Wundt is important in the history of American education for the following reasons. He established in 1875 the world's first laboratory in experimental psychology to measure individual responses to stimuli. 2. Wundt believed that man is only the summation of his experience, the stimuli that bear upon him. It follows from this that for Wundt, man has no self-will, no self-determination. Man is in effect only the captive of his experiences, a pawn needing guidance. 3. Students from Europe and the United States came to Leipzig to learn from Wundt the new science of experimental psychology. These students returned to their homelands to found schools of education or departments of psychology and trained hundreds of PhDs in the new field of psychology. The core of our problem is that Wundt's work was based on Hegelian philosophical theory and reflected the Hegelian view of the individual as a valueless cog in the state, a view expanded by Wundt to include man as nothing more than an animal influenced solely by daily experiences. This Wundtian view of the world was brought back from Leipzig to the United States by G. Stanley Hall and other Americans and went through what is known among psychologists as the Americanization of Wundt. Although Hall was primarily a psychologist and teacher, his political views were partially Marxist, as Hall himself writes, quote, I had wrestled with Karl Marx and half accepted what I understood of him. Confessions, and don't forget Karl Marx used the Communist Manifesto was basically Weishaupt. It's important to remember that, huh? So this is really a very fine chapter out of Sutton's book, America's Secret Establishment. This is the chapter, How the Order Controls Education. And I want to point out that nobody but Sutton in the writings on the order has ever really dealt with education. Sutton saw the importance. I mean, he'd been doing all the work on our, aid to the Soviet Union on technology and all for the Hoover Institute. But he really, he's the only one who ever connected the order with education. Yeah, you know, even this great book that we've all, that Sudden Leipzig Connection, this great book, I don't believe that Paoli Leone understood the connection with the order either. He wrote about Wundt. It's a fantastic little book. You couldn't get it. The viewers can get this book. I think it's, you know, there are a few very important books on education. I'd say that this is the #1 book on education that's ever been written. This little book. And I think Anthony Sutton agreed, because he got a lot of his work in his book on the order from the Leipzig Connection as well. If we want to start with the condition of the average American right now, who has been conditioned by the television and in the schools and pretty much in daily life, you know, with the community councils and all, it goes away from the individual. Everything is to get, well, John Dewey said it, we have to get rid of the individualism. Everything goes towards the collective, the group. And ever since the early 60s or 50s, they've had the training sessions going on. They started in Bethel, Maine, National Training Labs, to use sensitivity training to bring people together in groups, and they'd all spill their guts about everything. And once you've done that, you're dependent on that person, right? Because they know everything about you. So this is the way you form the collective. It really is very interesting, the sensitivity training, how it works. And it says right in the original documents that it's Chinese communist thought control. Well, Americans have been exposed to this now, you know, certainly since World War II. And they've become little collectivists, really, groupies. They think that way. Anybody who thinks as an individual really is looked at askance, you know, strange person, you know, having an opinion that is opposite to what I've heard every night on the TV or in school or in college. Strange person, these individualists, huh? So that's what we're looking at now. We finally, this is very interesting right now. I mean, talking about the Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board of Carnegie, you have, this is the chart showing that the University of Chicago, the School of Education, which had John Dewey and Charles Judd were there. Columbia University Teachers College, John Dewey Thorndike, who had his pet chickens that he trained, James E. Russell, and then James McKell in the Department of Psychology at Columbia. All those were all funded at Hopkins Medical School by Rockefeller Foundation's General Education Board and Carnegie Foundation. Now, when you think back to everything I've been talking about, the Carnegie conclusions and recommendations to change the American education, 1934, to change American education from the standard, you know, classical education that we have, basically to outcomes-based ed, because Carnegie, after they wrote that nifty little blue book that outlines a socialist America using Carnegie's views, they had something called the 8-year study, the Carnegie Corporation, which we didn't realize until I read something in the Education Commission of States used to have, or still does, maybe in Denver, has a newsletter. And I was reading it one day, and at the bottom of the page, I just saw something, and it said, OBE is simply because we were fighting OBE, outcomes-based education, performance-based education for workforce training, performance. And I turned the page, and I said, it's just a rerun, virtually, of the Carnegie Corporation's 8-year study in the 1930s. And I went, what? And then we went and we got the whole 8-year study out of the University of Georgia Library, because the editor of my book lives in Athens, Georgia. And we got the 8-year study. And the 8-year study actually is what they're putting in right now. It's the no grades. It's removing the Carnegie unit, which requires the old Carnegie unit. You guys went through it in school. You know, we all did. 4 years of math, 4 science, 4 English, 4 history, whatever, in order to graduate. And all of that has been removed now, because the student is not focusing on intellectual endeavor. It's workforce training. And so they're taking those years away, and they're taking